So this week we're beginning, it's obviously the last 2 weeks of the course, and we are beginning on the last section of the text, which it was split up into, components. And this week it's the practical. So we take all the things we've learned, and there are new concepts in each of these final chapters. But the point now is, how do we apply some of this to actually, addressing environmental problems and issues? And so the title of this chapter is making the just ecological society. How do we do that? How do we actually put it into practice now? And it begins with a very charming, ancient, uh, practically 2,000-year-old story of Androcles and the lion. I put up a film clip for you from the film. It's an old Hollywood film of Androcles and the lion, where you see what happens in the ring in the Circus Maximus when they meet again. And I saw that when I was a very little girl, and it was really, I always remembered that film, and I was so reminded of it and charmed by it when I read the fable in the opening of this chapter. And so, you know, the and that it was interesting that I had not known previously that it could have been based on a real incident, that 2,000-year-old fable. So what happens is that Androcles escapes. He's a slave in the Roman Empire, and he winds up in the wilderness running away. And he gets to this big cave, and he hears all this crazy roaring and moaning and loud noises. And out comes this lion limping. And of course, Androcles is terrified, but then he sees that he's got a very wounded paw. Now, apparently, the original fable said a nail. I've always known it as a thorn in his paw. I prefer thorn, so I'm going to use thorn from now. It seems more likely to get a thorn in his paw in the woods than a nail. So, scared as he is, Androcles takes the thorn out of the lion's paw and cleans it up as best he can, etc., etc. So they become buddies. They become friends, and Androcles is captured again, and escaped slaves who attempt to escape or do escape and are recaptured don't fare well. So his fate now is to go to the Circus Maximus. You think, the Colosseum, with thousands of spectators, and he gets to go out he is forced to go out into the ring alone, and then wild animals are often released to eat up the prisoners. You're probably most familiar with this from the Christian martyrs. However, this is an important point I want to make. That it was pre-Christian that the Romans were doing this to folks in the Circus Maximus. And although the film that was made by Hollywood, the clip I've put up for you, says that he's a Christian, and it shows him falling on his knees and praying when the lion comes out. That's not, as you know from reading the text in the original story, it was not about Christianity. Okay, it was pre-Christian pre-Christianity that the fable was written in Rome. So the lion too is captured, and he's there as a captured lion to be released to eat the human beings that are put in for the delight of all the Roman citizens. And you'll see clips of that in the film where it goes to close-ups of their faces, and they're all waiting to see the Androcles eaten by the lion. And then you'll see what happens. It's very sweet when the lion comes out, and they recognize each other from their time together when they were buddies. Okay, that's an interesting story, and it's a fun fable, parable, metaphor, whatever you want to call it. But why is it in our textbook? Well, it's there because there's a very important message about community in that story, and community and the environment, and how to bring the two together. into the biggest community of all, which includes, remember previously, the biggest community of all is everything. Okay. Not even just sentient beings, but non-sentient beings, rocks and water and all of that. So that's all of the community, the biggest community of all. Animals, plants, all of that kind of thing. And so that story tells this message of how to bring those things together, right? The two, community and the environment. And it covers the three foundations of ecological mobilization. Mobilization means, how do we move? How do we act? How do we create movements? Mobile is all about movement, right? Okay, so that's where, the idea of a movement comes from, and action comes from, whether that's sit-ins or marches or, letter writing, voting. Those are all examples of mobilization. So it covers the story of Androcles and the lion covers the three foundations of ecological mobilization, which are conceptions, connections, and contestations. That word contestation, you hear the word contest in there, right? Okay, that means, contestations kind of, butting heads in a sense. Conceptions, connections, contestations are the three foundations of mobilizing. Now you notice they all have the prefix con. And con can be knowledge, as to con something, right? Means to understand. It could also mean con man. It can mean cunning. Also contradict. Con can mean against, contestation, right? So what the environmental movement needs is to be all of the more pro meanings of con, connection, that type of thing. To create an ecological society, what we need is ecological knowledge, which are conceptions. Knowledge, conception. Okay. So we also need togetherness, the togetherness of community ties, which are connections. And we need effective strategies against the existing power structures, because the existing power structures rarely, if ever, welcome any kind of change, right? The reason they're the existing power structures is that they've formed a society where they can be that, and where those positions are inherited through wealth, through social class, through race, through gender, whatever. They don't want anything shaken up, So that third one is, we need to have strategies against the existing structures of power, which are contentions. So how do we mobilize? First of all, let's go with conceptions. Okay. Well, education is one of the oldest methods used around, existing, to mobilize an ecological society. There are literally thousands of environmental programs and education centers, programs in elementary schools, organizations, etc. Worldwide. In fact, the Elliott State Forest here in Oregon has just been made, instead of a forest to be logged as a resource extraction, it's now going to be a research forest, and have programs that are open to the public and school kids and that kind of thing, to see, what a natural environment looks like and what kind of critters are around and all that kind of thing. So all of those programs that I just mentioned put significant and value into education and outreach. That's how you get more people interested, right, in what's going on with the environment, through education and outreach. And then you think of all the TV programs and magazines and, from the Discovery Channel to National Geographic, that are also educational and provide outreach to people who may see a program on something in National Geographic or Discovery and get very interested in it and want to learn more or get active in something because of that. So then the next question here is, what is environmental education? And here's a long quote, but I think it describes it very, very well from the text. Environmental education is a learning process that increases people's knowledge and awareness about the environment and the challenges associated with it, develops the necessary expertise and skills to address those challenges, and creates and supports attitudes, motivations, and commitments to make informed decisions and take responsible actions. That last part about informed decisions is crucially important, as you'll see as we work through this aspect of environmental mobilization, the education piece of it. Okay. So what would be an example of taking responsible action? Well, you know, all those batteries, everything, we all use huge amounts of batteries. Now, you can recycle them. Here in town, the SWAC bookstore has a drop-off to recycle those batteries, and so do other places in towns. I think the libraries do as well. So once you know the damage, the informed decisions that you know, if you have the information, you can make the decision to take responsible action to change your behavior. It's just as easy to drop them into one of those receptacles than it is to throw them in your waste paper basket or whatever. So that sounds great. However, right, you have you've got the knowledge. You can make informed decisions. You can change your behavior, etc. Sounds great. However, if that were true, if it were that easy, we wouldn't have this problem. After decades of environmental education, we still have massive environmental problems. So obviously, there are some pieces missing that move people from information and knowledge to action. And that's what we're going to keep exploring here. So, and here's the problem. And I think we all know this individually. And if you are a teacher, you really know it. Gets reinforced, but I think we all know it, which this is this. The trouble is that knowing something doesn't mean you can actually do much about it. Or if you can, that you will do something about it. We all have examples in our lives of knowing, for instance, that something's not good for us, whether it's fast food, smoking, whatever. You can go on and on, drinking too much. We know that, right? We know it deeply in many cases, but we often can't motivate ourselves to do anything about it. So, and with environmental problems, it's so overwhelming that, as they say, there's not how much can you actually do, so there's that added aspect of stress in there. Why can we know something and not do much about it? Because it's hard. Those examples I all gave you they're not necessarily environmental, and they're hard. Now get to massive problems like climate change and things of that nature. So it's hard, and it's hard especially when you try to act as an individual against those huge issues, as I just mentioned. Climate change is an example. Now, as an aside here, I have to disagree a little bit with that analysis. There's something called Gandhi's paradox. And what Gandhi's paradox says, and he used this in mobilizing his grassroots movements of freeing India from colonial rule. And what his paradox is, nothing you do as an individual matters very much. but you have to do it anyway because it's a mass of individuals, right, that makes change. So you individually are not making dramatic change, but a collective of individuals does make massive change. And we saw that with Gandhi's movement. But the most recent example I was amazed to hear, oh, I don't know, I shouldn't be because it's about average, I guess, was this last election last week. And in Oregon, only 32% of registered voters voted. Well, think about the 60, almost 60%, what's that, 58% that didn't vote. They were just individuals thinking my vote doesn't matter. What would have happened if they'd voted? Well, we won't ever know, of course, but I hope you get the point there. So, having said that, right, let's go back to what the book says, which is that, individual action is seems overwhelming with overwhelming issues. And it's true that the pattern of our economy, our technology, the human built environment, and our ideologies, that's really important. They do present huge obstacles to taking action. It's just overwhelming. The system does not want change generally in terms of environmental action. And the other point is, not only is it kind of overwhelming because the systems are all pushing it back against you, the structures of society and the economy and all of that, but knowledge by it in and of itself doesn't guarantee action, especially action that becomes so inherent and prevalent that it becomes normal environmentalism. Remember we talked about normal environmentalism? That kind of action where you don't even have to think about it anymore, about whether you're going to recycle batteries or not, or separate your plastics and recycle them, those kinds of things, that's normal environmentalism. You're not even thinking about anymore. Well, to get there, to get to that point where your habits change so dramatically and completely that you don't think about it anymore, it just becomes normal, usually takes more than just simply knowledge. And we're going to find out what those things are here as we move on. In addition, on top of that, when people are told, this is really important, and I bet many of you have experienced this either in the media, but maybe possibly in classes that you're taking, maybe this class. So when people are told that they're doing something wrong, their beliefs are wrong, their actions are wrong, they often become defensive. And in order to reduce any sense of guilt, first you get defensive. The defensive comes from a potential sense of guilt that you're doing something wrong. And then what you do is you resist the knowledge, you refute it. Okay. And one way of doing that is by accusing the bearer of this knowledge of attempting to that you turn it around, right? Well, they're just trying to shame people in order to gain their own moral superiority over them. I'm sure you've heard that argument before. So what those people who become defensive and threaten do through certain kinds of knowledge is they turn the page, they click the remote, they go to another site where the information doesn't challenge them so deeply. Well, we could talk about the importance of having beliefs challenged for a whole other class, but it's really important. It's really important to have your beliefs challenged because it helps you if you're able to work through the process without becoming overly defensive and threatened. It helps you really clarify what you believe and think. Okay? So, does the fact of what those things we just talked about, the denial of knowledge and information for various reasons, does that mean that environmental education doesn't accomplish anything? No, it doesn't. It doesn't, because there are successes from that. There are people who do get it and change behaviors, etc. But what it does mean is that the behavioral approach to environmental problems, which is, the idea that if we just change an individual's attitudes, their behavior will follow. Um, that is not necessarily a helpful approach, that behavioral approach, because as we've just discussed, uh, you know, just because you change people's attitudes does not mean their behavior will change. You can acknowledge that some things, yeah, I should do that, but we don't often. So our attitudes might change, but not our behavior. So we need to look at knowledge that we're imparting uh, situationally. Now, what does that mean? It means understanding, or at least attempting to understand, the social contexts that people swim in, right? Because it's through those contexts, the social ones, that people are motivated to take action, right? Because we already know you can have the knowledge and not take the action, right? So how do you get motivated to take the action? Through social contexts, not intellectual or knowledge contexts, okay? So one of the things is suggesting that people take individual action often seems very overwhelming to people. So this idea that knowledge and awareness, that model of environmental action, that it's just simply you insert it into the brain, all this information, um, doesn't work, as we've talked about, because they're social matters. And sometimes, and I have experienced this many times in the classroom, sometimes people cannot even literally hear the information because it's so alien or threatening to one's identity or culture. Now, identity and culture are social contexts. I have not often, but I've had students get up and walk out of a class in the middle of us talking about something in the classroom that is just too threatening to their identity and or their culture. And usually it's both, particularly if they'll come and see me later and we talk about it. So let's now explore the cultivation of knowledge. Well, first of all, there's so many sources of information trying to get our attention, right? So one of the major questions is, which sources will we key into and which will we ignore? I'm sure you all have this experience as well. You have your favorite, sites you go to. I know most of you are too young to watch actual news programs and things of that nature, but you know what I'm saying here. Which sources will we key into and which will we ignore? To add to the confusion, not all sources agree, of course. Of course. In fact, their whole point in many cases is not to agree, to be diametrically opposed to one another. So this is both confusing and confounding because none of us is an expert in anything. In everything. None of us is an expert in everything. Even the experts are experts in some, very usually and often very narrow aspect of something in social science or science. Okay, so none of us, we have to remember this, none of us is an expert in everything. No one person understands the whole thing in environmental science, or as I said, anything else for that matter. What does that mean? Well, that means that each one of us has to trust someone else, right? Who knows more about some aspect of something than we can find out on our own or that we already do know. Okay? Now, to do that, we usually, as we just said, rely on others whom we trust to guide us. That's great, except that what if those sources that we trust are wrong? An example in here, this section of the book is, what if your friend who thinks they're an expert in wild mushrooms tells you that that mushroom isn't poisonous? Oh, that's great to eat. Fry it up with some butter, but it is a poisonous mushroom. Okay? So that is really important to think about when you say, well, I trust that side, or I trust that, whoever talking the head is, or social media influencer, whatever. Well, you have to dig a little bit deeper. But trust is crucial. It's very hard to do that because trust is emotional, trust is social. Okay? The point here is that education isn't just about communicating facts, and it never has been. Okay? Can you learn well from a teacher that just, you know, uh, repeats facts over and over and over and over? Never has any context or examples or stories about, how those facts relate to the larger sphere or to your life in any way. You don't learn much in those situations. So the learning that goes on with real education, once again, it's not just about communicating facts, it's fundamentally about trust. And the people from whom we gain a sense of what knowledge to pay attention to and what knowledge we can safely not pay attention to. Let me say that again. Education is fundamentally about trust, and the people from whom we can gain a sense of what knowledge we should pay attention to and what knowledge we can safely not pay attention to. Okay? Because of how central and important trust is, knowledge isn't just knowledge, as we've talked about. Knowledge is a social relation, and so is education. Now, think about it as the cultivation, the gardening of knowledge. What we think is knowledge, what we think of as knowledge, is actually a matter of our self-identity and the social relations of trust that both shape and come from our identity. Okay? Who do we trust, and how does our identity relate to those people who we trust? It's our first ones are usually our parents, unless we're in a horribly abusive situation. But generally, we trust those people around us and who socialize us. Okay. Now, here's the thing. That kind of relationship is interactive, it's ongoing, and it's created within culture. And the differences that that culture reinforces between ourselves and others. Look at the cultural dynamics that are happening right now in the US, and the identity that people have with those cultures and how diametrically opposed to one another many of them are. And that happens because what we know intellectually, or our cultivation of knowledge, what we know is who we are. And what we are and what we know are whom we know and whom we trust. Whom we know and whom we trust is where we develop our identity and our knowledge. Well, that's some pretty deep commitments, right, to those things. It's very hard if you're raised in a certain belief or religion, or, if you're political parties or whatever, ideologies. It is a deep, deep commitment that is created in families and friends and churches and cultures and, associations, etc. So it's very hard to change, is the point, because it's such a deep commitment. Can you see how this isn't just a matter of imparting facts to people and, oh, they're going to get it and everything's going to be different? No, it's very much, much more complex than that. Because a person's identity is who their family, friends, and associates are, and equally important, whom they are not, who are not their friends, right? What types of people, what beliefs do they have that are not their friends? So given that your knowledge is linked to your identity, and both are linked to both are linked to others. So your knowledge is linked to your identity. Knowledge and identity are linked to other people and your social relations. You can see that there's an awful lot at stake in your cultivation of knowledge. Those are the kind of things that, as the text says, are to the bone. To the bone. Your own identity, your friendships, your associates, your own confidence, sometimes even your own family. And therefore, they're extremely hard to change. This is a crisis that often happens when people go to college, when for the first time. It's a shock often to go home and you tell, and maybe you're excited about something you learned in your cultivation of knowledge, and you impart that to your family, your relatives, your family's friends, and man, it's diametrically opposed to their beliefs, and it can set up some real conflict. And that's why they say it's to the bone, because it's who you are, and that's very hard to change. So to cultivate knowledge is also to get a sense of what's ignorable. What can you safely ignore? Not ignorance, but it's there, but just ignore it. And doesn't mean stupidity about reality or ignorance. It just means when we learn what's important to know, we also learn what we think we can ignore. Sometimes we can, sometimes we can't, but it's what we believe we can ignore that's important, that's ignorable. So ignorable in this context means that what we believe and what can be safely disregarded or not thought about. So I know I believe this. I know this is a fact because all my identity and culture tells me that's true, so I can ignore all the rest. I can ignore all the other stuff. That's just noise. That's what they mean by ignorable. And so that kind of disregard of deciding it's usually not conscious, it's usually unconscious what we ignore, or we know it makes us uncomfortable a little bit, or it's a little bit threatening. There's some kind of little niggling feeling. That kind of disregard is central to what we consider, here we go with that word, important, right? If we can ignore it, then it can't be important. Okay? And that means what this means is to get beyond that idea of what's ignorable. The next logical step is that we can gain knowledge by paying attention, right? By not just ignoring things because they make us uncomfortable or they challenge us. Okay, I'm going to repeat that. We can gain knowledge by paying attention. Okay? But there's always a rub here, right? If we pay attention to one thing, then we're not paying attention to something else, actually. And in reality, we don't pay attention much more than we actually do pay conscious attention to things. That hopefully through learning will change, right? We begin to pay more attention because that's important. So how do we decide what counts for useful knowledge that's appropriate to our lives? because you can't absorb all the information and all the knowledge. No human can. Well, to do that, to decide what's the useful and appropriate knowledge for us, for our lives, there has to be some way to screen out so much of the noise, the information coming at us constantly. Well, one could just stop, spending so much time with social media, for example. That would be helpful. Um, but I don't know how many people are willing to do that, but that would be an important thing to do at one step. So how do we know what to focus on if we haven't looked at everything? And once again, you can't look at everything. Well, how will we know to focus? What to focus on if we haven't looked at everything? Things we are not looking at and will never look at. We don't. There's no way to know that for sure, exactly what to focus on. Okay. But here's how we grok that. Here's how we unconsciously understand what to focus on and what not to focus on from cultural cues. And from cultural cues with which we identify and trust. That could be racial, ethnic, family, religious. Those are all cultural cues, right? And you can think social class. You could go on and on and on. There's so many. Age. So that's how we learn what to focus on. From cultural cues with which we identify and trust, we decide almost without deciding. And I think it is without deciding. It's very unconscious for most of us, for most people. So what we are doing almost without deciding from those cultural cues that we identify and trust, we decide what's safe for someone like us to ignore. Smoking is another example. I don't know, littering, what are the cultural cues of the people that we trust about those things. So if they're powerful enough and we trust those people enough, we can just ignore information about certain things. Okay. So an example of how that can shift through knowledge is the practical farmers of Iowa, that whole section in the text. So how did they cultivate knowledge in the fields of Iowa? Which is, up until this grassroots organization started, was practically 100% industrial agriculture, full of herbicides and pesticides and, ways of dealing with animals that isn't very nice, actually, to either the animals or the planet. How when they wanted to start changing some of that, how do they do it? Okay, so the Practical Farmers of Iowa, or PFI, are Iowa's largest sustainable agricultural organization. They started as a tiny grassroots organization, and they're still pretty small compared to, you know, uh, there's 85,000 farms approximately in Iowa, and only 3,000 of those are members of the Practical Farmers of Iowa who are doing sustainable agriculture. Now that's grown from 2 or 3 to 3,000 and will continue to grow. How do they do that? Okay. So in 1985, the year the group began, there were no sustainable farms. It was, and still is, as we just talked about, primarily an industrial farm landscape. So why are there still, with all this wonderful information and research about the benefits of sustainable agriculture, why are there still only 3,000? Because of the structure of agriculture. When you bump up against major structural aspects of society, it's very hard to change them. Okay, because in the case of the structure of agriculture, there's certain markets, there's laws, technologies that prevent and discourage sustainable methods. They don't support sustainable methods at all. They discourage them. So those who joined the Practical Farmers of Iowa talked about, there's some interesting discussion in that section of the chapter. They described the unsettling period of rejecting valued cultivation knowledge. They had to reject everything their fathers and grandfathers had done on the farms and their neighbors and friends. And they described that as a spiritual crisis. And so that's how difficult it is to change, to radically change behaviors. Okay, you lose friends, you argue with the family, those types of things happen. So it's what is called a phenomenological rupture, this phenomenological rupture to the existing cultivation knowledge. Suddenly, for 100 plus years, 150 years, everybody thought they knew. Well, they didn't. In the old days, they didn't have the pesticides. So well over 50, 60 years, everybody thought they knew how to farm, right? And suddenly there's this new phenomenological knowledge that says, no, 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 that's not working for the environment. Or for farmers' health. They have a very high rate of cancer from herbicides and pesticides, farmers do, and farm workers as well. So, there's what happened with that was they suddenly, the farmers that were moving towards sustainable farming in the grassroots movement suddenly doubted the bases of trust which they had committed themselves to with industrial cultivation. They trusted what the Farm Bureau said. They trusted what the feed companies and the herbicide companies and all those people said. The companies that make the hormones that go into the cattle, they had trusted all of that. So when you make these huge shifts in in your cultivation of knowledge, it often is a spiritual crisis, as they put it, because what you trusted before, you can see now, was not trustworthy. Okay. So how do you create or cultivate what's called a dialogic consciousness? That dialogic word just means a dialogue, a conversation. Okay. So central to knowledge cultivation is not only the social relations of knowledge, and that social relations is just how you just know what because you grew up knowing that stuff, right? But it's also the character of those relations. So you can discuss things one way, the character of those relations. One way is to have horizontal conversations, which is dialogue, right? And that's how the Practical Farmers of Iowa did it with dialogue. Or there's these top down, as it says, a monologue, just some talking head or entity, a single entity telling you how things are with knowledge, supposedly knowledge. So some of the examples are like promotional campaigns that are fronted by, beautiful and famous people that they want you to relate to and feel like, they know you would like to know them. So these people do that or buy this product or whatever. So why don't you, makes you more like them. That's monologic, top down. Another example is religious leaders who promote a particular value by connecting it to tradition, top down. Another one is manipulation of nationalist sympathies by unscrupulous politicians. Those are all very common practices, and we're seeing many, many, and sometimes extreme examples of that today, aren't we? So the theory of frame analysis describes those top-down methods of knowledge cultivation. So the monologue, the top-down monologic method, those methods depend on how you frame the issues, right? And you frame them in a way that isn't really a dialogue. You frame them in a way that people will respond to them as the framer desires, pushing people's buttons, basically, right? That's called frame alignment. So the four basic tactics for aligning people's frames, how they hold things, how you can, kind of push their buttons, are the first one is frame bridging. So you link frames, okay? The second is frame amplification. And what you do is then you energize, you bump up the values, the particular values behind a frame. Those values discussions, they aren't discussions, monologues, ways of framing things and telling you things that trigger your values are very, very, very powerful. We're seeing much of that today as well. The third one is frame extension. It widens the frame's values. Well, if you believe that, then you're going to wind up either believing this or doing that bad thing, right? That's extension. Okay. And frame transformation is the last one, which reconfigures a frame's meaning. What's bad is really good. Kind of like Orwell's 1984. War is peace, love is hate. Those were two slogans from 1984. So you transform the frame. Now, virtually any social movement or even any social interaction involves some framing. It's almost impossible to do it without some kind of framing because we all have to choose the words we use, right? And when we choose our words, we do so with the audience that we're talking to in mind. It's actually another term for it. It's called code talking. How we speak to one, I'm sure, you speak with your friends and whatever, vernacular or slang, you use is different than you use to people of my generation, possibly, or instructors, or, people in positions of authority or whatever. So we're all kind of framing all the time. It's the extent of it and what the motive is behind it that's the issue here. So Aristotle talked about, in the Art of Rhetoric that he wrote, he identified three forms of persuasion, and we often use all three at the same time, interestingly. One is ethos. Now, you know that's the root of ethical, right? Ethos is convincing by getting the audience to feel that the speaker is ethical and trustworthy. Okay? The second, these are convincing arguments. Pathos talks about it. Pathos is a root for feeling. So pathos is convincing people by getting the audience to emotionally experience the speaker's point of view. Logos, sound familiar from the word logical, the Greek root for the word logical, is convincing people by getting the audience's agreement on the logic of the argument. So these are the three main ways. Ethos, meaning that the speaker's an ethical and trustworthy person. Pathos means that they can get you emotionally with their argument, and logos, that it's a logical argument. So frame analysis goes a bit deeper. It restates the ideas of Aristotle's, and his insights. And to preface this, what the environmental movements is not a top-down, from an authority figure, monologue. What it really wants is a dialogic communication, which is, a conversation, a discussion, a dialogue. Now, we have to acknowledge there's some monologue in every, argument, but generally what the environmental movement wants, it's much more democratic in that sense, small d, in that it wants everyone to be able to participate and hear ideas from different sides, etc. So, therefore, if we want a humane, liberatory education, not liberal, liberatory, that frees us, that liberates us, that is truly based on trust, if we want that kind of education, and not the appearance of trust, this is just what gets me also very frustrated and agitated sometimes is this appearance of, oh, trust me, you know. But that's the appearance of trust, right? That's not truly trust. So if we want a humane, liberatory education that is truly based on trust and not the appearance of trust, the main approach should be what the great philosopher and teacher Paulo Freire called consciousnization, okay? Which means the building of critical consciousness in dialogue. Critical consciousness leads to kind of a wide awake creativity, not just sitting there nodding your head, oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. You know, I hope you've experienced that in your education, that wide awake creativity, that aha moment, as they say, where, oh, or a paradigm shift or oh, I get that. I want to know more about that, you know, that type of thing, or I can relate to that, whatever. That is consciousness in dialogue, in conversation, in learning. And critical consciousness leads to, you know, as I said, that wide awake creativity. And it doesn't emphasize persuasion. No one's trying to persuade you of anything. Instead, what it's trying to do is develop your critical capacities. That's why we emphasize critical thinking so much. You know, there's a huge argument in academia about whether you can, quote, teach critical thinking. Some say yes, some say it starts so early in life in your socialization that it's not that you can't learn to think critically, but that it's much more difficult if that wasn't part of your identity and cultural social relations, right? So that's what one is trying to do in dialogue and in conversation, in the cultivation of knowledge, is to develop people's critical capacities. And it welcomes differences and disagreements as ways to grow and to grow together in the conversation. Um, for example, the grassroots organization, the Practical Farmers of Iowa, one of the things they did was they randomized and replicated agricultural plots where you lay out experiments on your farm, some using sustainable agriculture, some using industrial agriculture, and then you track the yields, right? So you get real information. It doesn't take a lot of critical thinking or thinking critically to be able to see which one's doing better. You can measure the vitamins and minerals in grass from one plot as opposed to the other, et cetera, et cetera. That's the kind of knowledge and information that can actually change your mind. So, and I put up a video of very short, I think it's 5 minutes. I was so pleased that I could find a video on this exact organization, the Practical Farmers of Iowa. So, many of the farmers say that after and once they've moved to this sustainable model, one of them said, this is a quote, I probably wouldn't have taken that step if I hadn't had the knowledge to document what I was doing. And that's after this kind of actual research, on the ground research they were doing. And some people there to hold my hand. That's the social. The knowledge is what he said. Probably wouldn't have taken that step of moving from industrial agriculture to sustainable agriculture without the knowledge, without the information, without the experimentation, right? But he also needed to help him through it because it was a spiritual crisis, that shift, as he said, and he lost friends, etc. And that's the social, the people that were there to hold his hands through the process and support him through that process. So how do we attain togetherness rather than this awful, awful conflict we're seeing today, ideological conflict, and knowledge conflict too? We do it by mobilizing social connections, which is the opposite, obviously, of what's happening today. We're immobilizing our social connections, unfortunately. And so this is where the tragedy of the commons comes in. Garrett Hardin wrote his. This is another parable in 1968, The Tragedy of the Commons. And here's what he wrote about. So there's shepherds grazing their sheep in a communal pasture land. You personally have only 10 sheep, so after a while you add more, and you think I'd be better off with more sheep, make more money. Well, others see you adding more sheep, so pretty soon they're adding more sheep, right? Now there's a lot more sheep grazing that finite amount of land. So that finite amount of land is only so big, the pasture, and eventually it's overgrazed and the grass is ruined. Now everybody's sheep start to die, and they wind up with fewer sheep than they began with. And on top of that, the eroded land is no longer capable of supporting as many sheep as it had originally supported, resulting in economic and environmental disaster. If you want a modern day look at what happened thousands of years ago, or at least 1,000 years ago, look at modern day Greece. Much of the islands are completely barren, and that was overgrazing by goats that caused that. So Hardin's story, his parable, his article of the tragedy of the commons, was intended as a parable for all environmental problems. And the three modern examples that Hardin used were traffic pollution, traffic, pollution, and overfishing. Okay. Because, for example, our streets are kind of commons, aren't they? We all use them. We kind of collectively own them in terms of paying taxes and that type of thing for their upkeep. The oceans are also commons to a great extent. But, one of the things that he was pointing out, Hardin, was that, okay, traffic jams are on the rise. Traffic deaths are on the rise. And look at the fuel costs. Look at the pollution. There's the quality of the air. We all know about overfishing and endangered fish species, et cetera. I think we all know that. So those are all examples of what social scientists call the problem of collective action. A bunch of people do something, and it dramatically affects, in this case, the environment. So in a world of self-interested, that's a key description, in a world of self-interested actors, how do you get people to cooperate for their own benefit? Because it's not benefiting everybody to have huge amounts of air pollution, fish species dying off, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So that's the question. How do you get people to cooperate for their own benefit? Individuals acting in their own rational self-interests often result in irrational collective outcomes. Okay. You take a bunch of individuals acting in their own personal self-interests, and it often has very irrational outcomes for the whole group of people, i.e., the shepherds in the tragedy of the commons. Okay. So the result is this powerful paradox of social life. We often do not act in our own interests when we act in our own interests. Let me say that again, this paradox of social life. We often do not act in our own interests when we act in our own interests. We can't see the consequences, right, of a whole bunch of people acting in their own interests at the time. Often those consequences appear later. Okay? So it sounds pretty serious, and it is in a way, but it really isn't as bad as all that, because there's a modern, well, that was 68 that he wrote The Tragedy of the Commons. Subsequently, the tragedy of the commons, that idea, that concept has become one of the most discussed concepts in environmental sociology. And the main reason it's so discussed is to point out basically its flaws, right? How oversimplified and overstated Hardin's allegory is. So to begin with, in his criticism of that idea of the tragedy of the commons, he seems to blame common ownership of resources for the tragedy. But there are many, many both ancient and modern examples of the highly successful use of commons for resource management. Currently, today, grazing in Africa, Asia, and South America are examples. Okay, so instead of a tragedy of the of the commons, according to this more modern critique of the idea, it should be characterized as the tragedy of individualism, of a bunch of individuals acting for their own individual benefit, okay, rather than the commonality. So, what breaks down the commons is not collective ownership, but rather the unwillingness of the herders to have a broader view than their only narrowly conceived self interests. Okay. Uh, you know, it's really something that if all you think about is your self-interest, you don't get that that's going to affect other people. But that's the parable of the tragedy of commons, how that's presented. So even more significant is the view of a rational choice of human motivation, you know, because that's all based on rationality, right? That we're going to only act in our own best interests. But don't forget that equally important are those sentiments we talked about. We're much more complex than just that simple rationality. And those sentiments also inform our choices, as we learned. So, because equally important to rationality are the norms, the rules, ideas, right? The feelings and affection or lack of affection for others in our social life. They are a crucial aspect of who we are, of our humanity, uh, and our interest as well. So, to think about that, to understand that, you can see the flaws in the analysis of the tragedy of the commons. Okay, we're going to stop here and move on. Next one.